Hi everyone, I'm Madals, and on the couch with me right now we've got Team Liquid Snute and My Insanity's Kane. They were having a cool discussion about the current Zerg meta, just chilling out, and I decided to interrupt their lovely conversation and get it on camera instead. So, guys, firstly, thanks for joining me. Obviously, both very well-known players, both here at Dreamhack. What are your thoughts on Zerg currently in the meta, just in general? And if I start with you, Snoop.
I think Zerg is doing okay. There are not too many imbalances, but I feel like Terran is having a bit of a resurgence. CVP, I feel like Zerg is doing really well at the moment. But against Terran, I'm not so sure.
Yeah, I have, like a lot of people recently have been saying that Terran has gotten quite a bit stronger. But actually, after trying some of the stuff that Snoot told me about, including Swarm Hosts, I actually feel like CVT is one of my favorite matchups, most fun to play, and also I'm not having too much trouble with Terran at the moment. It's more ZVP where I have trouble, but I don't think that's a meta thing. I think it's just me having trouble with it. So I think right now it's fairly balanced.
Okay, so you mentioned Terran, both of you, as quite key things. What do you reckon is one of the reasons why we're seeing a bit of an increase in the TVZ matchup? What do you think's caused that? The Widowmine change, or is it just a meta shift?
I think all the changes that buffed Terran in the early game made it really difficult for Zergs that, you know, I'm not particularly good in the early game myself, so the patch really hurt my win rate a lot. My late game, I feel like late game Zerg is extremely favored when it comes to Swarm Hosts, Mutas, Vipers, Infestors and all of this. But in the early game, Terran has so many more options now, and the map pool is also not that bad for Terran, so I wouldn't say it's necessarily imbalanced, but it takes a lot of skill for Zerg to get to the later stages of the game. At least I feel like, to me, personally, it's very difficult to survive the early stages against Terran right now.
And you can.
Yeah, for me...
I might pass that over to you.
Sure, yeah. For me, it wasn't so much the Widowmine change that affected the matchup. It was more the Hellbat buff, because it opened up so many more options in the early game. So what ended up happening was either the Zerg made it to the mid-game or late game just fine, or you would just kind of die in the early game. That's what I found anyways. And yeah, there's just so many all-ins that can hit. We saw that in Happy versus Mini-Razor in WCS. Like, he just died to Hellbat all-ins very early. And I mean, unless you see it coming, unless you prepare for it, which slows down your economy quite a bit, then you just kind of end up dying. So I think Blizzard's intention was to kind of interrupt the Zerg's economy, which they were successful with. But it was almost too much. I don't want to say that because I'm not too sure, but I fear that it opened up too many options for Terran in the Terran all-ins in the early game.
Okay, so moving on from Terran, what about up against Protoss? So the only non-mirror matchup left. What are your thoughts in ZVP at the moment? Anything you're liking? Anything you're disliking? Anything you're playing with? And I'll start with Kane this time.
Okay. So ZVP has always been my best matchup, but recently I've been having quite a bit of trouble, especially with the European style of play where it's much more defensive. Versus Koreans and Americans, they just all in a lot, and I know exactly what to do. All you have to do is defend and then you win. But versus defensive styles of play, I find it much harder to break, and it's almost like Swarm Hosts are needed. I've talked to Stardust a bit, and he said that in the late game, you almost have to go Swarm Hosts, especially once you get to 4 or 5 bases. So, unfortunately for me, I used to play Swarm Hosts quite a bit, but when I went to Korea, I kind of stopped using it so much. So I kind of lost my confidence in that play, and I think it's important for me to practice that and keep up with it. But I think there's a lot of options that Zerg have nowadays, especially in the mid-game. So I think that it's quite a balanced matchup right now.
Yeah, I think Zerg has options as well, but like Kane just said, it's in the late game and the end game you need to go Swarm Host, and it's a bit of a boring limitation. I wish I've been experimenting a bit with different types of Swarm Host play, like Swarm Host Muta Viper, just like against Terran. But so far it seems like just yeah, you have to go Swarm Host if you want to be successful against Protoss. And on bigger maps like Deadwing, things can go really awkward because Protoss can have a lot more workers than you and still have a very strong army. So, yeah, maps like Deadwing are kind of... I feel like Deadwing is a really good example of the different extremes of Zerg styles. You can see some players going really hard on the mutas, and you can see some players trying to play Swarmhost on Deadwing, or some players just make Hydras and run up the ramp. I think if you just take all the different metas you see on a map like Deadwing, then you get a really good impression of what CVP looks like right now. And I think if you look at these games and you see how long they go, you will see that the Zergs that don't use Swarm hosts eventually will lose against the maxed out Protoss. Maxed out Protoss is a huge problem if you don't have Swarm hosts. So I kind of wish maybe the Ultra Infestor Viper combo would be even a bit stronger. Maybe Banelings could be something. Maybe Drop could be a bit more useful. But yeah, right now the only thing that really works and feels good is Swarm host. And I wish it would be a bit different, that you could use maybe Banelings to some greater effect. I don't know. But I don't know where to start to make changes to that.
Okay, so finally on matchups, ZVZ obviously most recently in terms of the meta change was the Broodlord Frenzy change. A very nice change. I was there when there was stalemate ZVZs and they weren't fun for anyone. Now that's obviously come through. How's the meta shifted? Has anything really substantial happened? How are you guys playing it for the moment?
Yeah, everything's the same, just without the Swarmhost thing. I feel like we got some really interesting stuff going on with Tunnel and Claw Roaches. And the Broodlords are really cool to work with as well. I've seen some really insane Sky Zerg versus Sky Zerg and Broodlord, Hydralisk, Infestor, Queen. Some really grand scale battles. We had the same in Wings of Liberty, but back then, because the Infestor was so strong, the battles back then felt a bit more stale, because it would be mostly Broodlords versus Broodlords, and the Infestors wouldn't even reach forward. And right now the Infestor is a lot weaker, so the ground armies have a lot more potential. And I feel like the endgame CVC battles really take tremendous skill, and they also have some very interesting dynamics to them.
Yeah, ZVZ right now for me, it's my favorite matchup. I think it's the most boring to watch, but it's for me the most fun to play. Yeah, I know you're kind of cringe, but like, the European style is a lot different. Like, the Korean style is only Roach. And if it's very, very rare that it gets past that point. European style is a bit more fun to watch in that, like you said, there's a lot of different things that can happen. But in my games on Europe, like, I usually, this sounds quite cocky, but it never goes past Roaches for me. Like, usually I get Tunneling Claws and the players just fall apart with multitasking and stuff. So I think the meta is so much different on Europe, and I actually think it's quite a bit behind. Recently it's been catching up a bit more, but yeah, I can understand how people would be bored with Roach versus Roach, but like Snute said, I hope that more cooler things are happening. And even in Snute's play, you kind of see that as well, going up to Infestors, Hydras, Broodlords, stuff like that. So I think one of the things with StarCraft is it's quite a defensive game. And when you have a defensive game, you're able to get those big armies up and those big cool battles happen and stuff like that. So it's kind of cool.
Okay, so you briefly touched on Deadwing earlier in ZVP. What are both your thoughts on the current maps in the map pool? Any you particularly like, any you particularly don't like? What kind of shift would you like to see in maps overall?
I think the map pool right now, at least for CVC and CVP, is very good. I'm not sure about Terran. It's very easy. I feel like we only have a few maps that are very good for Zerg. Overgrowth is probably the best, and then maybe Deadwing. But they usually get vetoed right away. And the maps that are left, I feel like, are a bit challenging. But it's one of the better map pools that we have, I would say. I don't find the whole too bad about it, really.
So I think the current map pool is quite good as well. I think that versus Protoss, it favors a very defensive style, which can be hard to break sometimes. Unless you go Swarm Hosts, in which case you don't really need to break it. Versus Terran, I think it's quite good for Terran right now, especially on maps like Foxtrot, where there's a lot of chokes and it's hard to use Ultralisks. So I think Swarm Hosts, again, are the best option. So I think it favors a very defensive style of play right now. But what I'd like to see is a lot of features, new, unique features, like even small things. On King Sejong, for example, there's the back rocks. And even that small feature of that one map introduces a lot of different styles of play. Like you can hide a bunch of lings, break down the rocks, and go through their back. And a lot of players won't even check, or they won't see it coming. So that's really cool. I'd like to see more features like that in the map pool. But overall, it's pretty good right now, I think.
Awesome. So finally, just to finish off, thanks for sitting down. Where can people check you out? Anyone you want to shout out? Just briefly.
Yeah, at Liquid Snute on Twitter, and just shout out to Team Liquid for being awesome.
I'm at MYI Kane on Twitter. Shout out to you guys for doing this, because it was a lot of fun. And yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you all very much for tuning in. If you've enjoyed, make sure you like the video and subscribe for more great content from Dreamhack Stockholm. Catch you soon.